Thanks, John. I don't know how many of you know this about me, but I love to go to garage sales. Anybody else in here like me? Just love to go to garage sales. I love garage sales. I love vintage stores. I love to go to consignment stores. I love it so much. When we were down in Oregon just a few weeks ago, we were staying at our family's house, and I woke up early and went to get coffee for Priscilla and I. And wouldn't you know, on the way back home, there is a bright yellow sign that's pointing to a garage sale. And so I follow the signs all the way to this garage sale tucked away in this little neighborhood, and I'm looking through stuff. I'm having a heyday. I'm loving it. Until I get a text from Priscilla saying, "Where are you? Everyone is waiting on you to get back. We have to go somewhere and we need the van." I was like, "Oh, I better go." Now, the reason why I like garage sales so much is because usually you can find something that either you need or most likely something you want for a good price, right? Or a good deal. And I know that not everybody is like this, but I love to haggle someone for a good deal. I love to talk to them about a good deal. And so I have learned, though, as I've been doing negotiations, when I have not gotten the best deal. You ever get into a garage sale and they go, "Okay, just give me a price, throw a price out." And so you're like, "Yeah, I'll give you 200. And then before you get the number out, they say, "I'll take it," right? And you know, I should have offered lower, right? You know, "I'll offer you 200. I'll take it. 200 pennies. 200 pennies is what I was going to offer you." So where we find ourselves this morning is we find Abraham bargaining with God kind of in a similar way. Here's the thing about God, though. God lets him actually offer a lower number, not once, but 5 different times, for the most precious items in the world, a righteous human soul. And so we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 18, starting in verse 16. But before we start reading, just a very quick recap from last weekend. Remember, we talked about Abraham welcoming the Lord in human form, and he's with 2 other men. And these 2 other men are angels. So it's the Lord and 2 angels in human form who have just sat down to eat a very fine meal that Abraham has provided for them. So that's where we're starting this morning and where we're picking up at. So Genesis chapter 18, starting in verse 16, it says this: "When the men got up to leave after dinner, they looked down toward Sodom. And Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And then the Lord said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him, for I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him.'" In other words, Abraham and his offspring, they're going to play a significant role in the redemption of the world, right? And so the Lord wants to share his plan with Abraham here about what he's about to do. He's sharing his plan with him, and he says, "Should I hide what I am about to do from my friend Abraham?" Okay, it doesn't say friend there, but you look at other places in Scripture and you see that Abraham was a friend of God, or God was a friend of Abraham. And so you actually see Abraham being called a friend. And when you are friends with somebody, what do? You share intimate knowledge with them. You share things that you're going to do. You share your plans with them. And it deepens the relationship when you do. And so this is 2 friends talking, the Lord and Abraham. But not just that. I think what the Lord is doing here is he's bringing Abraham into dialogue, because God didn't actually need Abraham's permission or anything like that to do what he was about to do. But I believe he brought him along in conversation to show him the reasonableness of his actions that he was about to do. the reasonableness of his actions that he was about. God knows that Abraham is going to be affected. He's going to be impacted for what God is about to do in a big way. And so he needs to share his plan with him so he understands some things about what he's going to do. But I think he also tells him his plans for another reason. Genesis 18:19 says this, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. See, God wanted a reliable witness for what he was about to do here, what his plan was. And he wanted that reliable witness because he wanted someone to pass on to future generations what they were about to see happen. God wanted Abraham to tell his children and his children's children and their children's children. He wanted what was about to happen in this plan to be passed down generationally in the Israelite or Hebrew community, okay? So this event that we're about to see will become very, very important to the Hebrew people, extremely important to them. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. But continuing on in verse 20, it says, then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. The men, that is the two angels that were with the Lord, they turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. So when the Lord says the outcry, notice that word, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. When he says that, it kind of harkens back earlier to Genesis. If you remember when Cain killed Abel in Genesis, earlier on in chapter 4, the Lord said, he said this to Cain, he said, your brother's blood does what? It cries out. It cries out to me from the ground. The Hebrew term for cry out describes a cry for help in a time of distress, essentially. The word is used most often, exclusively in reference to a cry from a disturbed heart. Somebody is in need of some kind of help and they're hurting and they're crying out to the Lord. There are incredible, incredible wrongs happening in these cities. And these cities are allowing them to happen, perhaps even encouraging them to happen. And so what is so encouraging to me is that the people who have been wronged in these cities, whether it's their blood or their shrieks of terror or a victim's anguish that they've buried deep inside, it all has reached the ears of God. God has heard it all. It's kind of a strange way to think about this, but did you know that sin has a sound? Sin has a sound. God hears the victim, and he knows the culprit's thoughts. He knows their actions. He knows what's done in broad daylight. He knows what's done in the back bedroom or in the back of the van. Or these cries for help, they all reach the Lord's ears. And so God says, I'm going to go and check in on it. I'm going to go see what's going on for myself. So once again, I don't want you to think, I'll try and explain it. I think God here was being accommodating to Abraham. Abraham is about to witness God's judgment on these two cities, right? He's about to witness God's judgment, and God is letting Abraham know that whatever decision he is about to make about the judgment of these two cities, that it is going to be first-hand knowledge to God. That Abraham will see the Lord go down into Sodom, into Gomorrah as a human being, and he will know that whatever happens next is because the Lord saw it for himself in the first person as a human form, if that makes sense. I think God is being accommodating to Abraham here. I don't think he really needed to know. I think God already knew. But I think he does this for Abraham's benefit, to get that firsthand personal knowledge so that Abraham would understand. He wouldn't be questioning God's justice and his actions. But who is Abraham really thinking about here, right? Who is Abraham thinking about at this time? Who has pitched his tent at the entrance of Sodom earlier in our story? Who does Abraham know who lives near the city? Abraham, of course, is thinking of his nephew Lot right now. He's got a nephew down there. I really don't know how much Abraham was thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah and having compassion on them. In fact, he may have just thought, those cities are getting what they deserve. It's time for judgment to come. He may have thought that. But he's thinking about a couple of people there in that city that he loves. And so he says these words to God in 1823. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Then Abraham spoke up again. Now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Once again, he spoke to him, what if only 40 are found there? He said, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. And then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there? And that's when the Lord said, get to the point, Abraham, all right? He doesn't actually say that. He says, I will not do it if I find 30 there. Abraham said, now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there? And he said, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10? What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. So Abraham makes his initial offer of 50, and the Lord quickly says yes. And he's like, oh, maybe I should lower that offer, right? So Abraham proceeds to make a lower and lower offer. I find the patience of the Lord here pretty incredible. He already knows what he wants to do, but he allows Abraham to ask him to change his plans for the sake of 10 righteous people. And did you notice that Abraham was not just concerned about these righteous people, but he was concerned about the Lord's reputation? Did you see that? Far be it from you, God, to judge the wicked with the righteous. But God moves forward with his plans anyways. And so the story transitions back to the 2 angels on their way to Sodom. And I have to say, before we get into this next section, you need to know that it is quite a long reading, okay? So I wanted to get as much of the full story as I could of this in Genesis chapter 19. But that being said, even though it is a very long reading, I guarantee you, you will not fall asleep. And so I preface the next section not with an apology for Scripture, because I won't apologize for what Scripture says, but I do apologize to those of you in here who are parents. If you might want to cover your child's ears, and if you don't, I just want you all to be aware, all you parents in here, that you may have some things to explain on the car ride home, okay? Just saying, you've been warned. Genesis chapter 19, starting in verse 1. All right, so the 2 angels, so they arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. Now, this is an important tidbit of information for us because it means that Lot was now a prominent member of society there in Sodom. He was probably a part of these elders there that would sit at the city gate. They would debate issues, conduct business, they would resolve disputes, and they would even advise city councilors of good policy and things like that. And so Lot was there at the city gates, meaning he is inculcated in this community. He has become a prominent member in this community in Sodom. He was an important figure in the town of Sodom. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did not go with him and entered his house. Okay, once again, we see the first law of the East being enacted here. Hospitality was an honored tradition in that culture, and Lot is doing that here. But I want you also to notice that Lot insists extremely strongly that they do not stay in the city square. It almost makes you wonder what Lot had heard, what Lot perhaps had seen happen to visitors who stayed in the city square at night. He had prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them, and he shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing." And it gets worse. It is embarrassing to read this stuff, you guys. Verse 8. He said, "Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out, and they pulled Lot back inside to the house, back into the house, and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door. The 2 men said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place." The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters. He said, "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, can you believe that word, church? When he hesitated, the city's about to be destroyed. Angels are telling him, "Get out of here." And Lot is dragging his feet. When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. But I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." He said to him, "Very well, I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of. But flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." And that is why the town was called Zoar. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew these cities where Lot had lived. And you think it can't get any worse, but it does. I wasn't going to go through this, but I figured might as well just get it all over in one sermon, okay? Verse 30. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine, then sleep with him, and preserve our family line through our father." That night, they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up, which is a polite way of saying he was so drunk he didn't know that he had had sex with his daughter. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight. And you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also. And the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. Talked about that at communion today. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites today. So people tell me, I don't read the Bible too much, it's too boring. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Right? You must not be reading the same Bible I am. You know, this is really quite a story, church. It is, wow. And I think that this story, it teaches us something important that we need to focus and pay attention to, okay? I think the first thing that it teaches us is this: God is moved by intercession. God is moved by intercession. Abraham asks God over and over for a lower number of righteous people to be saved because he's thinking maybe, he's kind of adding it up his mind. Maybe Lot has a wife, maybe he has a couple kids, maybe some servants, 50 people. And then he's like, well, I don't know if all of them would be that righteous. I don't know. So he keeps lowering it and lowering it and lowering it. But what he's trying to do is just, God, save my nephew Lot, please. Save my nephew Lot. You know what's sad is we come to the conclusion of the story, there weren't even 5 people who were righteous in that city. Only 3 people were saved out of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm not sure they actually really deserved it. Chapter 19, verse 29, look at this. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham. He didn't remember Lot, he remembered Abraham. And look what he did. And he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. So the text actually indicates that God spared Lot not because of Lot, but because of the cries of Abraham. Now, I don't believe that my prayers change the purposes of God, but I do believe that my prayers change the way God accomplishes those purposes, if that makes sense. Intercession isn't asking God to do something that God doesn't already want to do, or that it contradicts his nature. God has made a sovereign choice to alter his purpose based on what he hears, if I could say that. So I think what this text teaches us is that God is free and he is willing to make decisions in light of what he hears. He listens to the prayers of his people, interceding for others. The crying out to God actually makes an impact on how God responds in his purposes. God is not eager to destroy. He is actually eager to save. He wants all to be saved. And I suppose that's why God doesn't understand, amidst all the cries that reach his ears, why he is not hearing more prayers of intercession. Isaiah 59:15 says this, "The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice." He didn't like there was no justice. "He saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene." God isn't just displeased with injustice. He's displeased with no one talking to him about it. Intercession is asking God to bless somebody, a blessing for somebody, while also stressing the glory that it will bring to God. Lot might have been the least person who deserved to be prayed for. And there are people in your life and in my life who probably don't deserve for God to intervene in their life. But that's not what intercessory prayer is about. It's not about praying for people who deserve it. It's appealing to God and his nature and the glory that it will bring him if he moves in that person's life. Crying out does impact the way that God responds in his purposes. Abraham, I'll explain it like this. Abraham thought there was two options, right? One option was God destroys everything. The other option was God saves everybody because of the sake of a few. But God had a third option that Abraham didn't think about. That God would continue in his purpose and his plan with Sodom and Gomorrah, but also while saving a few from destruction. I think this story begs the question, do we believe that our intercessory prayers change the way that God writes his story? Does the future actually depend on what God is hearing from us? Because I believe God is moved by intercession. But I also believe that God will move against transgression. God cannot turn a deaf ear to the sound of sin. He hears it. God is incredibly merciful. He is incredibly patient and loving. But at his discretion, he will at some point say, that's it. That's enough. And judgment comes. And he will judge the wicked. The utter depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah, it had become infamous in that day. So much so, everyone in Canaan and beyond knew what went on there. To put their immorality in perspective, I read this from one commentator. He said, consider this, the polytheistic, superstitious cultures of that day, many of them were practicing temple prostitution, child sacrifice as a part of their fertility rites. Those people looked down on these cities as debauched. That's how bad it was. Sodom and Gomorrah was depraved and it was utterly, utterly wicked. What kind of city is it where all the men surround a house to do what they wanted to do? What kind of city is it where Lot is afraid to let these men stay in the city square? What had he seen and heard? Perhaps a better question, what cries had reached God's ears from that city? Some might object, and they might say, well, Sodom and Gomorrah, they didn't actually have a chance to hear that their destruction was coming and have a chance to repent of that. They were not warned sufficiently enough. You know, what's so interesting is that if you do the math, Shem, one of Noah's descendants, was actually still alive. He was still around at this time. There was still a guy hanging around who had been through the flood. And so they heard about the flood. They knew about God's judgment in the flood. Well, God must have just been prejudiced against them, no? Do you remember that God actually allowed Abraham to save their kings, both of them, when he rescued them from Kedorlaomer in that story? So this is something that is important for us to remember as we read this story this weekend, that this story of Sodom and Gomorrah was actually very extremely important to the Jewish people. If I was to ask you, what is your top 5 favorite Bible stories, particularly in the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah probably wouldn't make your top 5, would they? You might say Noah, you might say the Exodus, Daniel and the lions did, maybe, David and Goliath. You might say those, but not Sodom and Gomorrah. But if you were to ask a Hebrew what was one of the most important stories to them, you might be surprised how quickly they would say Sodom and Gomorrah. If you look, you will find that 22 more times in the Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be mentioned. To the Hebrew, this was one of the most critical, revealing stories of how God interacts in history with men, about his character and his intention. For example, Peter would say in 2 Peter 2:6, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. You see, God wanted the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to be a warning to all men. That God's ultimate judgment would come on all sin. That God will move against transgression. It's a warning that God wanted Abraham's kids to tell their kids, and their kids to tell their kids. And I think it's a warning that we must pass on to our children as well. So Jude would say in verse 7, in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion, and they serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. God must do right. He must judge sin. He must silence its sound. And so God did that with a hail of fire into cities. I think it's something that we need to pass along to our children, that story, so they understand. But so is this final point this morning, and that is our moves toward Sodom, they lead to godly regression. So I heard a story about a lady's son who was getting ready to go off to college, and she was concerned for her son. She didn't want him to be around those bad influences at college, and so she didn't want him to be corrupted, so she wrote this letter to the president of the college, and here's what the letter said. It said, "Dear sir, my son has been accepted for admission to your college, and very soon he will be leaving me. And I'm writing you to ask that you will give your personal attention to the selection of his roommate. I want to be sure that his roommate is not the kind of person who uses foul language or tells off-colored jokes, who smokes or drinks or chases after girls." She said, "I hope you understand why I'm appealing to you directly. You see, this is the first time my son will be away from home, except for his 3 years in the Marines." So, now, we as parents, we struggle, I think, to teach our kids appropriate relationships with other people, right? Appropriate boundaries within those relationships. And we hope that our children, that they do value relationships. We do hope that. But the other side of that is that relationships often determine values. Does that make sense? Relationships determine values. And I think this truth is profoundly illustrated with the story of Lot and his family that we just read. Now, Lot knew the reputation of these two cities. He knew about it. Everybody around knew about it. So he only planned to live near the city in a tent. But we find Lot in chapter 19 at the gates, well established in that community. And he owns a home in the city of Sodom. Lot appears to be the ultimate success story. He's an immigrant boy. He comes to the town. He makes it to the top. He has a family and a life now in the big city. He's really made it big. Now, I'm sure Lot rationalized all this by thinking, I can do a lot of good in that city. Think of all how I can be a voice of influence as a righteous person in this city. But how much influence did Lot have in Sodom? Apparently, he had political influence, right? We know that. But his spiritual influence, it never brought about revival. He had so little spiritual influence in that city that his sons-in-law didn't take him seriously when he was warning them about the destruction of the city. They thought he was joking, that he was a joke. The people there, they may have respected his business savvy, or maybe what they were doing is they respected the nephew of the great warrior Abraham, who bested kings and saved their towns. Yeah, we want somebody on our side like that, so we'll accept this nephew of his into our town. Maybe they respected him for that, but they did not respect his spiritual life at all. I think Lot was willing to compromise a lot for a buck. Lot was a very rich man in Sodom. He was even perhaps very religious there, but he never was really truly happy. Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7, he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. How much influence did Lot have? Well, you'll have to go to the bottom of the Dead Sea, where Sodom lies in ruins, to answer that question. The question we need to ask is, how much influence did Sodom have on Lot and his family? Nothing that Lot gained was worth what it cost his family. I want you to see that, church. It changed his wife. The allure of the world was so deeply embedded in her heart, she could not imagine life without it. You know, I don't think she was turned into salt because she turned around and all of a sudden saw this fire and hail coming from the sky and the smoke. That word that says she looked, it's the same word that's used of David seeing Bathsheba taking a bath, and he won't avert his eyes. He won't turn his eyes away. It's the word of Eve that says she saw the fruit and she desired and wanted it. It's not talking about she saw the smoke, she saw this fire, and she turned around and disobeyed by turning around. It's saying even after an angel grabbed them by the arm to take them away, she's looking back at the place she wants to be. I want to be back there. I don't want to be with you. I don't want a future without Sodom. She became the perpetual example of danger, of fatal attractions. Look what Jesus talks about her. Luke 17:32. He says, remember Lot's wife. Do you remember that? Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life will preserve it. And then there's Lot's daughters. First of all, you see how accommodating that Lot has become in the city by the choice of his daughters' engagement, who they were engaged to. I've never noticed this before until I was studying this week, but who was surrounding Lot's house at the time? It was all the men of the city, from young to old. And when the angel told him to go and get anyone else that he may be related to or know, what did it say? It says, so Lot went out, I'm thinking outside of his door, and he spoke to his son-in-laws. Now, I can't prove this, but I think his son-in-laws, I think they were already at the house. He just went out the door to talk to them. Abraham, if you know the story, he determined to not let his son marry a lady of the land. In fact, he sent a servant all the way back to the hometown to get a wife for his son. But Lot gave his blessing to the men of Sodom. And then there's just no way to describe Lot's daughter's actions to become pregnant as anything but deplorable. It shows how much influence on their thinking living in that city had on them. They had to know that their scheme was dishonorable, or they wouldn't have tried to get their father drunk to do it. Their brazenness to name their sons Moab means from father. You know, when you named a child in that day, It was to tell a story. And they'd ask you, Isaac meant laughter. Someone would ask, well, why do you name him laughter? And they could talk about how God gave them a baby. Moab, from father. Why'd you name him that? Imagine that story. Moabites. That's who we're talking about here. And Ben-Ami, son of my kinsman, is what it means. I really don't know what Lot's daughters went through to get to this point. Perhaps the sexual exploits of their peers that they must have been telling them, during the slumber parties or something like that, or heaven only knows what they saw and experienced in that city. I don't know. But I will say this. It would be hard for me to respect a man who said, take my daughters and do whatever you want to them. Just don't hurt these complete strangers that just come under my house. I really don't know what sickens me more. The acts of the men of Sodom or the cowardice of Lot to protect his daughters. Lot pursued Sodom. And the reason why is because it was lush and it was rich like Egypt. He had seen Egypt. The irony is Abraham stayed away from Sodom and he died a rich man. Lot went to get rich and he lost all his possessions in the fire that he worked so hard to accumulate, and he died poor in a cave. The story, I think, warns us that no one just wakes up and then suddenly becomes carnal. Our moves towards Sodom lead to godly regression in our lives. The Bible says that we are like sheep who have gone astray. How do sheep get lost? Well, they go from one tuft of grass to the next, just nibbling their ways, keeping their head down. They nibble their way to lostness. And that's what happened to Lot. He just got further and further away from his calling. And that's where a lot of preachers leave him and the story. That's the message of Genesis 19. Don't be a carnal believer. The price is too high. But I want to close with just one last thought, and that's this, that a faithful Redeemer saves a lot. This story, it definitely has a warning for us for sure, but I think it also illustrates the mystery of the grace of God. I've bashed a lot on Lot today, but I also have to say I think we will see Lot in heaven one day. What does this say about God and His grace? It never ceases to amaze me the value that God places on every soul, that He even saves a lot. God knows how to destroy sin and save. God can pour out His wrath while removing those that He has chosen to spare. He did it at Sodom, and He did it again at the cross. And by the way, you are going to be saved the same way that Lot was. Look at this last verse that we read earlier, verse 16 of 19. When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his two daughters and led them safely out of the city. And did you catch this last part? For the Lord was merciful to them. How amazing is the grasp of God's grace. He even got a lot. So we're going to sing a closing song right now, and maybe right now there's someone on your mind and heart that needs intercession prayer. You need to intercede for them. Go to God on their behalf. We have a prayer room in room 9, and you can do that today. There's somebody on your heart that you need to intercede for. Do that today. Or maybe you want to experience the mercy of God today. You need to be rescued from the coming wrath that God put on Jesus for you. You don't have to take it. It's a free gift of God. Come and be baptized into Jesus Christ today and allow the mercy of God to reign in your life. Accept the grace of God in your life today. Won't you please come to the front and do that, or go to the back in room 9. Please come while we stand and sing.